with that, we're going to move into our next pre-lunch segment. As you know, we are celebrating our 40th annual summit. And does that mean that we've necessarily been around for 40 years or more than 40 years, or how long have we been here? So what I'm going to do in this segment is share my screen, talk a little bit about where we've been in the last 40 years, and then have an interesting segment by our colleague, Jason from History Colorado, really kind of talking about, from a historical perspective, what does this look like? So with that, what are we seeing 40 years? One of the things that's interesting to know is that we were created in statute, and you can see notices maybe even as far back as in the late 60s of the state demography in, or at least these roles in statute. And it's great. It says that we have to produce population estimates and forecasts. Good. I'm glad that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. This is the best part, that we shall cooperate and give assistance to other agencies and organizations. So that's great to hear. And I actually didn't read that in statute until just a couple of weeks ago. Glad that that's there too, because that's one of the, I will tell you, one of my more favorite parts of the job is being able to interact with all of these different organizations within the state. And then lastly, that we'll give these annual presentations of our information to the agencies and organizations to really review our basic demographic assumptions with the sole purpose of trying to create the best data and information out there. And again, that's why we hold these meetings and why we're celebrating our 40th year. So a little bit of history about our office. We've, at the very beginning, we definitely existed for population estimates. That was like the sole initial function, really for planning, fund distribution, and working with the Department of Health in terms of denominators for all of their different rates. We became one of the first state data centers in the country, a partner with the Census Bureau. And so remind you, this was pre-internet. So we started in 1982, and we would get all of these big volumes of data sets in these books from Census Bureau. We would mail them out to a lot of people. We would also fax and mail photocopies of the book to people. There was one person in the office, or a couple people in the office, that's all they did all day was photocopy and fax information for folks. In the early 90s, they did a quick transition into a dial-up system instead of faxing all of the time. And this is actually when I first met the state demography office, was during dial-up. I was working up at CSU and we connected. Thank God that was short-lived and we moved into the internet. And the great web development that the office went through, going from downloads to different tools to different visualizations. We've always been a decennial census partner. We found swag in the office going back to 1980. I don't know if we go back further than then, but definitely supporting decennial census operations first in terms of preparation, a lot of maps and a lot of boundaries. If we went down, there's the basement, which is very scary here in the office. We can see reams and reams of these big, huge maps. That we used to use. And so we've always had kind of this cartography and mapping component to our office, and it's now transitioned into all of the great GIS work that we do. We added in projections in the late 80s, really for program planning for state agencies and local governments. Added an econ section in the mid 90s because we really realized that we needed to understand what was going on economically, because that really drove population change. And like I said, we've been holding these annual conferences for about 40 years, and started off as about 20 folks meeting around a table, now to an event like this where we've got over 400 people on the system, 500 earlier this morning, in terms of really reviewing our data and information. So we've had some staff over these 40 years. And here's a little snippet of some of the folks there. We've had a couple of people that made it over 30 years. If anybody remembers, in that bottom left corner, we've got Becky Picasso and Richard Lynn, both over 30 years in the office. Our own Cindy DeCrone is at 28 years. And then you'll see one of our big mainstays in the office has been Jim Westcott. He retired in 2008. He was in the office for about 25 to 28 years. You can see him pictured there, both in the bottom left as well as with that Census 2000 sign. Then you can see the rest of our staff that have come and gone over the years, but simply an amazing group of people that have been part of this office. We've seen some technology changes, thank God. Moving from faxing and mailing data to a great website, moving from a mainframe. And Cindy will vividly remember having to recode things when we moved from that mainframe into DOS. And in the bottom right there, you'll see that disk. That is a 4 meg disk that came from our mainframe. We have it on the wall in our office here to remind us of the good old days. We also moved from photocopies and scissors to visualizations, and Jim Westcott, pictured there, was infamous for cutting and pasting, or cutting and taping. A lot of different things in order to help him work through some of our data sets, and moved from transparencies to PowerPoint. Again, thank goodness, because I can't tell you, when I even first started this job here in 2004, we were still working with some transparencies, and I can't tell you how many I melted in the photocopy machine. We've also seen some population change. We've actually almost completely doubled in population from 1980 to 2020, increasing from 2.8 million to that 5.7 million. If we look across the state, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue are counties that have declined over that 40 years. It's interesting, if we look at the 10 top counties listed in 1980 and in 2020, they're almost exactly the same. The only difference is that we had Mesa County fall off and Douglas County come on in. And about 85% of that total change in our population occurred in those 10 counties. Fastest growth by far was in Douglas County, increasing from 25,000 people in 1980 to over that 360,000 in 2020. As Cindy said, really age is the biggest change in our office, in our state. And we can see those two lines. We can look at the orange line is 1980 and the blue line is 2020. We can see those baby boomer bulge right around that kind of 10 to 20-year-olds in 1980. We can then definitely see how young we were in that orange bar in 1980, with the dominant age really in that 18 to 34-year-olds, compared to now where we're seeing the dominant age group in that 35 to 64. So definitely a significant change in our age distribution over these last 40 years. We can also see a great deal of change in our economy. A lot of the folks this morning talked about changes in the economy. Interestingly, our jobs, total jobs, increased by more than double over this time frame, really illustrating how important or how significant job change has been in our economic growth. And we can see the changes by industry. In some on that far right-hand side, very little change. If we look at mining and agriculture, compared to the right-hand side where we see some significant increases in finance, real estate and insurance, construction, local government, transportation and warehousing. But I also had to pull out on a separate little bar just the incredible increase in the number of service jobs that we've seen grow in the state, increasing from a little over 400,000 to over 1.6 million by 2021. And I use 21 since 2020 was such a weird year. More importantly than anything, I want to thank everyone for your consistent collaboration with our office, all of the data sharing, and especially all of the ideas you provide to us in terms of looking at new products and different visualizations. and things of that sort to help us do what we do. So with that, what I'd like to do right now is introduce our colleague, Jason, from History Colorado, to talk a little bit about how Colorado's changed over the last 40 years.
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth. Can you all hear me okay? Good? All right. I know we should all be great at online conferences by now, but there's always that moment of doubt. My name is Jason Hansen. I am the Chief Creative Officer here at History Colorado. What that means is I have one of the best jobs around. I get to do a lot of the fun stuff that the museum does. Hopefully you all think that museums do fun stuff, but exhibits and collections and publications and fun things like that. That's what I spend my days doing. But I am thrilled to get an invitation like this. Historians like me are always flattered when we get invited to important conversations like the ones that you are having here today. I didn't prepare any slides, in part because I assume by this point in the day, you have seen a lot of slides and mine would be way less interesting and informative than the charts that may have been on those slides. I also realize that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I will try to be more engaging than my slides might have been. And I will also try to not drag things out. I mentioned that historians, we are flattered when we get these invitations. I dream of President Biden or some other president convening a council of historic advisors, sort of like the Council of Economic Advisors. I'm just putting that out there in case anyone here has the ear of the president. But here in Colorado, we have taken the first step and established a model with our State Historians Council, which brings together 5 historians from across the state to advise on historical questions, such as whether to rename certain places in Colorado or to provide historical perspective on contemporary events. I work with the State Historians Council, and this sort of work, talking about demographic trends and how we got to now, is exactly the sort of work that we like to do. And briefly, just in case you don't know much about History Colorado, we are the state's historical society. We were founded in 1879, which is only 3 years after the creation of the state, rather ambitiously, I think. I am today, you can't tell from my blurry background, but I am at our flagship museum in downtown Denver. We also operate community museums and historic sites around the state, and even a historic railroad at Georgetown, which is a lot of fun if you haven't had a chance to take a ride. We care for 15 million items in our collection, which stretches back across 13,000 years to the earliest humans to call these mountains, plains, and mesas home. We also operate the State Historic Fund, which recently celebrated 30 years of making grants to preserve historic places in Colorado, totaling more than $2 billion in economic impact. And we flatter ourselves by thinking that historical perspective is critically important to building a thriving society, really never more so than today, more than maybe I ever dreamed of back in grad school. We believe that we can draw upon our history for lessons that make every Coloradan's daily life better and hopefully light our path together to a brighter future. That's why kids always get free admission at all our museums, and why if you have a 4th grader, you get a free membership for the whole family. So pretty grandiose claims. My colleagues always roll their eyes when we talk about, what we are doing here. And I say something like, I'm here to try and make the world a better place. A little Pollyannish, I know. So, why am I here at this conference other than Elizabeth and I appeared on a couple of panels together and she was nice enough to ask me, but what can I add to a demography conference? And I think what I can add to your conversation today is hopefully a little bit of historic context, and by way of that, a little causality and sense of contingency. I know that demographers deal in trend lines in ways that I love and use in my research pretty regularly. The trend lines are fantastic, but they are also not destiny. There were some pretty specific events that conspired to bring us to this moment, and I think reflecting on those could help us think about how things might follow the trend lines or go in different directions. And I think we're at a moment where I think it's worth thinking about whether there are some different directions we might be headed. So what I would mainly like to talk with you about today, since we're talking about this time frame, 40 years, or really back to the 60s, when references to the state demography started showing up in legislative conversations. I want to talk with you about the story of this period of time, which I think is one of the most important stories in Colorado. I can make an argument on a good day that it is more important than the gold rush even. And it is what we historians call the rise of the New West. It's important because it addresses a fundamental question that underpins many of the questions that you are addressing here today. That question, it's the most fundamental question. Why are we here? And by here, I mean, why are we in Colorado? If people tend to follow jobs, as I have been told very convincingly by eminent demographers is the case, then why are the jobs here? They certainly don't sprout up wherever we need them, or growing jobs and cities and so forth would be a much more straightforward enterprise, and all of your jobs would be a lot easier. So thinking about what historians call the rise of the New West helps us think about those questions. It may even help us think about what the future holds for different parts of Colorado. And it's a story, this rise of the New West, that begins with World War II. So a little bit, please forgive me, a little bit before our time frame here, but I promise it's necessary prelude. It begins with World War II, and it begins with federal spending. During World War II and the following decades, the federal government established a number of enterprises here in Colorado. You can probably name them off on your fingers: NREL, NCAR, NIST, NOAA, Federal Center, Rocky Mountain Arsenal, Pueblo Ordnance Depot, Air Force Academy, NORAD, an expanded Fort Carson, a number of facilities supporting the uranium rush in Grand Junction, plenty more. It's a lot the federal government is investing in Colorado. In fact, direct federal spending in Colorado between 1952 and 62 accounted for 20% of the state's total revenue. And that's before you factor in some of the other federally supported projects like constructing I-25 or I-70, the research dollars flowing to universities. It was a massive federal investment. And that massive federal investment had several effects. Most basically, unsurprisingly for all of you, I am sure, it brought people to Colorado to work in those jobs. I don't need to tell this group that the Front Range cities that embraced that federal presence and where most of the federal spending was concentrated saw, with only a few exceptions, incredible growth rates decade over decade from the 1950s really to the present. So it's no surprise that legislative references to state demographic projections go back to the 1960s, because it was clear to everyone by that point that something big was going on, and legislators needed help figuring out what it was and what to do about it. In the suburbs around Denver, we see cartoonish growth rates that reflect the literally just add water growth of sleepy mining and farming communities. Broomfield, Westminster, Thornton, Louisville, Greenwood Village, Castle Rock, Parker Centennial. These are all exploding as newcomers flock into those communities, and also many white residents fled central Denver. But even established communities, think of Fort Collins or Boulder or Colorado Springs, saw overall population growth of more than 40% in the 1970s. So it's booming here. And the federal enterprises, the research labs and military installations and so forth, attracted other industries that wanted to locate near them. You know, I'm sure most of you have stopped yourselves in the last week and wondered things like, why is Lockheed Martin here? Why is IBM here? Why is Ball Corporation here? And it's no coincidence that those businesses and other household names around the state today decided to relocate to Colorado during the 50s and 60s. Just one example, Ball Brothers, they really are the people who make your canning jars, but they wanted to get into the aerospace industry. So in the late 50s, they established a research lab in Boulder to capitalize on the talent that federal funding was attracting and the proximity to the work going on at federal facilities. So much of our aerospace, science, technology industry leaders are here in Colorado because of that massive investment in the Cold War military-industrial complex. And Colorado's population growth is, as a result, deeply ingrained in that complex. We can thank the federal government's Cold War investment for an awful lot of it. You're all familiar with, the overall impact of investments. So even when the federal government wasn't directly funding an enterprise, businesses were locating here because they were working with the researchers and scientists and engineers who were funded by those federal dollars, or they were serving them, sometimes dinner, but other times, building houses. I know some folks with a construction company here in the metro area that is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And one thing I've told them is that kind of longevity, 50 years or even 40 in the case of this conference, in really any enterprise is something to celebrate. But it's really pretty hard to imagine a more foolproof business idea than opening a construction company on the Front Range of Colorado in the 1970s. So it does. Federal investment creates jobs here in Colorado. I know I'm not telling you anything new at this point, but that's not what the rise of the New West is. That's just a great federal investment story. What we mean as historians when we talk about the New West is that the federal spending that we just went over introduced new dynamics that really created a structural shift in Colorado's economy and society. Namely, the way I like to say it is that during this period, the West's natural amenities became more important than the West's natural resources. Colorado's history from the gold rush up to World War II is really powered by natural resources, extractive industries, whether they were mining or agriculture, extracting nutrients from the grass and turning them into the steak on our plates, or from the soil, turning them into vegetables and other crops, or timber, even to a limited capacity here in Colorado. What we were lucky enough to have in this place in the mountains and on the plains was what was driving the economy. And I think we know this intuitively. But starting with World War II, those investments weren't reliant on those natural resources. They were reliant by and large on the fact that we were in the middle of the country, and therefore we were more secure than the coasts and a good place to locate important work during the Cold War period that followed World War II. And so a lot of people came here, whether they came to work at one of the federal facilities or at Lockheed or in construction or at the diners along Colfax. And that's where the New West really comes in, because what all those people flocking to Colorado do is they create a leisure class, people with money to burn at numbers that Colorado had never seen before. And those people with money to burn were looking for ways to enjoy themselves in this place. And they happened to coincide with a moment when the outdoor recreation industry was getting started. The veterans of the 10th Mountain Division, the 10th Mountain Division was the famous soldiers on skis who had trained at Camp Hale near Leadville and then led the breakthrough against Nazi lines in the Italian Alps that allowed the Allies to liberate Italy. I'm sure many of you know the story. It's a great story, and Camp Hale was actually just designated by President Biden as a national historic landmark. Well, those veterans returned from World War II and started the ski resorts that many of us enjoy today in Colorado and elsewhere in the country, but ski resorts outside of Colorado really aren't the same thing. You know, and more than that, they helped make recreational climbing popular. They helped make backcountry camping and backpacking popular. These were activities that were just starting to take off with Americans before the war. But it was the federal government's investment in developing gear that would help the 10th Mountain Division and other troops fight in winter in the Alps and in the rugged environments that really, you know, the gear was adapted, and that's what supercharged that nascent pre-war interest into a full-fledged outdoor recreation industry that today is one of the pillars of Colorado's economy. This post-war era also creates teenagers. Let's not overlook the teenagers. If we define teenagers as, and I say this as the parent of 2 daughters who are rapidly becoming teenagers, fully grown humans with minimal responsibility and money in their pockets. The kids of all these workers who have come to Colorado for jobs. So there's this class of teenagers, and for really one of the first times in history, on a widespread basis, they are not going to work in the mines or on the farms. They are footloose in a way that is fairly new in history, and they're able to focus on doing the things that they like. And so they start to support a music scene here in Colorado up and down the Front Range. They start to buy records that they like. They start to support all kinds of cultural endeavors, and they create this energy. And these cultural endeavors, they feed on one another. They start to create a youth culture, which we can see in the charts that Elizabeth just shared related to age. And this is where the New West, I think, really, it's where it takes on its own shape, because this is the key definition. You start to have people who are moving here not for the jobs, but because they really wanted to be in Colorado. And I think we probably all know some people in our lives who did that, who just moved here because they wanted to be here. But there are 2 really prominent examples that we all know, who I like to point to. One is a guy named John Duchendorf. He had passed through the Rockies on some family vacations when he was growing up, and decided he wanted to make a go of it as a singer. He started in LA, but he realized he really wanted to be in Colorado. So he came to Colorado, and he loved it so much here that he changed his name to John Denver, and went on just a year or 2 later to write Rocky Mountain High, which is today officially one of our state songs. Someone in the state demographer's office, maybe 5 years ago, told me that I really can't say this is causal, but I think it's enlightening, that in 1972 and 73, the years when Rocky Mountain High was topping the music charts, those are the highest levels of population growth that Colorado has seen since the early mineral rushes. He is singing about a Colorado lifestyle, and a lot of people are wanting to get a piece of it. And it's not just because there are magically jobs here. It's because by then people are coming here and they are figuring out what are those jobs that they can create, that they can earn a living at, that will enable them to live that Rocky Mountain High lifestyle. So the other good example, who we all know, is an unemployed geologist who really just wanted to live in Colorado, and so decided to start a brew pub not far from here on Wine Coop Street. John Hickenlooper could have gone to try to find another geology job in Texas or some other place, but he decided he really wanted to stay here in Colorado, and that brewing beer was the job that he could do. And as the Wine Coop took off and the craft brewing industry along with it here in Colorado. It created more jobs and another lifestyle marker for people to spend their leisure time and disposable income on. And then, of course, just to prove that the New West is not terribly different from the Old West, in some ways anyway. The saloon owner became the mayor, became the governor, became the senator. So growth has continued and maybe started to plateau, maybe even to decline in some places. But I think when I look at the map that Elizabeth shared right before I came on, with the warm colors being growth and the cool colors being decline, you know, what I see is there's not decline in those places that welcomed and attracted federal investment in the decades after World War II, or in the places that benefited from the growth of the outdoor recreation industry. Those are the places that are the growing areas on the population maps. And so it leaves me with two questions, and I'm going to end with these two questions and give you all a chance to discuss them or ask some of your own questions, and then we can all get our lunch. But my first question is, if growth is really slowing down, does that mean we have reached quote unquote peak New West? That the New West as an era, as an explanatory vehicle of our history, has peaked and is itself beginning to decline? Is some other historical cultural force starting to guide things here in Colorado? Because if so, I mean, that does happen. And if so, there's a lot of benefit to be had by those who figure it out first. And I would put my money on a group like the one here today. And then my second question is, you know, as a historian, I tend to think in these big sweeps, you know, statewide. I know that's often the case demographically as well, or at least at the county level. And I wonder sometimes about the pros and cons of thinking about growth from that statewide or county level perspective rather than a more local perspective. Because there really are sort of two different experiences happening, whether you are in Arapahoe County or Kiowa County. And I struggle a lot with how to reconcile those two things in the work that I do. I'd like to leave it there for discussion and questions. Thank you for letting me join you today. I will be brief in my answers so that we can all get to lunch, I promise. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Jason, so much for, you know, your comments and thoughts and reflection. And I think that question about, you know, where's the West headed is an interesting one for sure. And where do we fit in that picture? And I think with some of the other questions that or points that other panelists had made earlier this morning, maybe before you joined, really had something to do with water and how does water fit into that picture as well. There is one question that has come up from an attendee. It says, please share comments or examples, if possible, about how the preservation of historical sites contribute to local economies and enhance that sense of community among the people that live there currently.
Absolutely. I am happy to. I think there are a number of examples that my colleagues over at the State Historic Fund point to. A couple that I've recently come across. One, well, so generally, preserving these places not only, as you say, creates a sense of community. It often, in some of our smaller communities, preserves the Main Street areas of communities in important ways as economic centers and social centers. But it also creates opportunities, business opportunities to imagine new uses in places so that we don't just end up moving on. One example that I'm excited about is down in Pueblo, the Holmes Hardware project. This is a repurposing of a large hardware enterprise into a sort of food incubator, like Avanti here in Denver. It has the promise, like any of these cool places do, to become a magnet that attracts more businesses, more people, in the same way that we just talked about with federal investment. This is the kind of investment. It's not, obviously, you all know this, not the federal government's not the only entity capable of making those Kickstarter type of investments that attract more economic activity around them. So that's one example that comes directly to mind. I understand it is opening in just a couple of months, and I'm pretty excited to go check it out.
Perfect. Thank you for your thoughts on that. And I will tell you, there's a lot of comments in the Q&A saying, "Oh, no way, my mom moved here too," because of John Denver.
I think people tell me that all the time here at the museum. I know anecdotally that a large portion of Coloradans are here because of John Denver.
Well, super. I want to thank you, Jason, so much for your time today and contributing to our conversation. A lot